Joining me now is Clete Willems. He was the Deputy Director of the National Economic Council in the Trump administration. Clete was one of the key negotiators for the United States with China for the Trump administration. Great to see you.
Likewise.
Thanks for being here. Appreciate it. How many more Steve Maddens are coming down the line? Because the election happened Tuesday night. They jump on the earnings call on Wednesday and they say, you know what? We're starting to get out of here.
Right. Well, I think a lot of companies realize that with President Trump back in the White House, you are going to get a very proactive, robust policy on China. Let's not forget, a couple years ago when President Trump was first elected, being this tough on China wasn't the only game in town. And there was a lot of dissension about how the United States was going to deal with that relationship. There were a lot of people who still thought maybe through the normal way of doing business, we would change China and we would have peace and harmony on the trade front. President Trump changed that conversation. He's back now. I think he looks at what's happened the last couple of years. The Biden administration hasn't necessarily held the line in every respect. And so he's going to come back and he's going to be tough.
So they haven't, you say haven't held the line, but they did keep every single tariff in place.
Right.
And then they added some on top of that, or at least have wanted to add on top of that. So where does Trump go from here? Because you know how this goes. It's all a negotiation at the start with Trump.
Right.
And then you end up, who knows where you end up? So where do you think this goes, or where do you think this ends?
We don't know for sure what the policy is going to be in terms of tariffs on China,
okay.
Right? I mean, this is something President Trump is going to pursue in a very robust way. I think that all the details need to be worked out. But to your point on the Biden administration versus Trump, right? Look, here's the difference. You know, you're right. The Biden administration did maintain the tariffs, but they had a very lethargic policy with respect to China. When President Trump was in office, he was proactively engaging with China, raising the tariffs as appropriate, taking other measures to try to get them to stop their unfair practices. And you haven't seen that kind of proactive engagement out of the Biden administration, and I expect that to change. I expect there to be a broad use of tariffs to try to get China to change some of that behavior, because left unchecked, what are they doing? They're not only hurting U.S. companies in China, they're actually distorting global markets in a more pervasive way than they were a couple years ago.
So just like anything, Clete, with time comes experience.
Yep.
Right? You sat at the table across from the Chinese team negotiating during the quote-unquote trade war. The United States learned a lot about China. China learned a lot about Donald Trump. From your vantage point, from having been there at the table, let's take both of these. What did we learn about China?
I think one thing we learned about China was when we amped up the pressure, they were forced into a position where they had to deal with us. And let's go back in time, right? When the U.S. first took the $50 billion action against China, the first set of tariffs, China basically told us to take a hike.
Okay.
They didn't engage. They didn't take it seriously.
It was nothing to them.
Correct.
Okay.
But as he continued to ramp it up, all of a sudden they came to the table and they wanted to deal. And so I do think that China, especially with the vulnerable economy that they have today, right? I mean, China is not in a great position domestically. And so I do think that, you know, we might be in a position where we have even more leverage over them than we did back then. And I think the playbook last time is something that President Trump may want to pursue.
Okay, so that's what we learned about them. The $50 billion, doesn't move the needle. You ramp it up, it moves the needle. What do you think they learned about Trump?
Well, I think they learned.
I see a deep sigh there.
Well, they learned that he's serious.
Okay.
Right? They learned that when he makes these kinds of threats about broad-scale tariff action, he may just well pull that trigger. And so I think China has to take him seriously again, and is going to have to engage. Now, again, I don't know how this is going to play out. That is up to the president. Right? But I do think one of the things he will want to do early to test China is to get a sense of, what are you actually going to do about this Phase 1 deal? You know, we worked hard.
The one that was implemented, that you and your team negotiated.
We worked incredibly hard on this deal. We inked it, and then the ink wasn't even dry. COVID hit us. There wasn't really a chance to try to implement that. Then the Biden administration came in, and they threw the deal to the side. And so I think the first question that Trump may want to see is, okay, China, are you actually going to follow through? Okay. And then that may dictate where we go from there.
Is that resumption of trade war, quote unquote? It was called a trade war back then.
Yeah, well, look, I don't know that I would put it as we're resuming a trade war. In many respects, the trade war has never been over.
Right.
As I mentioned,
they kept the tariffs.
Well, they kept the tariffs, but also China is continuing to ramp up excess capacity. Right? I mean, if you talk to most economic analysts, they say that China is coming for the world, not just on steel and aluminum, but EVs and a whole range of other products. And so we have no choice but to try to protect ourselves against those kind of unfair practices.
Thank you for watching, and make sure you go to joinnn.com to find NewsNation on your television provider. And don't forget to click the red subscribe button below to get more of NewsNation's fact-driven, unbiased coverage.